Well, welcome to the last session of Nuts and Bolts and New Ventures. We've been on a 2-week journey. Just to recap, we started off in session 1 with introduction to the case that's the backdrop for everything we've been doing, and that's virtual ink. And it's really a great backdrop for this journey we've been on. It was not a technology in search of a problem. It was a solution to a perceived problem, and I think Yonald will tell us about what he perceived there. It was, although it's got a bunch of technology in it, it's not so difficult to understand conceptually as to what was trying to happen there. It's also a good backdrop because of the entrepreneur himself, Yonald Chery. This was his 3rd entry into the then 50K competition. So it's a lesson that sometimes you have to persevere and kill some things in order to get something that looks good. And of course, he went on to found Virtual Ink. He's going to tell that story tonight, and other ventures. And he's also been on the funding side. So all of that's really great. But I think the really important feature about this case study for this class is Yonald comes and he really tells how it really happened. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It gives you a real sense of what he went through and lessons to be learned for you in your own journey. So with Yonald's bio is on the website, and I'm not going to spend time going through all of that, but I'm going to turn it over to Yonald, and the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, Yonald. Take it away, sir.
All right. Thank you very much for the intro, Joe. I just want to point out that this is the 25th year of my having gone through the 50K contest. So it was 25 years ago that I essentially was sitting in the seats where many of you would have been sitting if we were all on campus and lecture. So, and I'll go into a bit more background, but I've been a part of this course for the better part of 20 years in trying to share my personal and professional story with this first entrepreneurial venture, starting as a student, because I think it sort of makes the experience realistic to a student who's sitting in the classroom, in this classroom, and thinking, okay, well, if what was that experience like, going from a classroom and trying to boot something from scratch, and it's not always what you think. I think MIT has a great brand name, and it can attract any of the Fortune 200 CEOs and all the fantastic unicorn startup company CEOs, and you learn and you get to hear these really rarefied 7 Sigma, 8 Sigma kind of example stories, and sometimes they're presented often as the norm, and really it's not. So part of what my goal here is to really impress upon people that there is a spectrum of experiences, not to frighten anyone, but to be a bit more realistic about what can happen and a bit more prepared. All right, I'm going to jump into a couple things. Whoops, hang on here. Background wise, essentially, why I tell the Virtual Ink story. Is when I started, I was not very confident about anything about business. I was a career, and I had become a career technologist and business person since. But at the beginning, as Joe mentioned, this was my 3rd idea back then. And I was very much an idea generator person, but didn't really understand what it would take to start a business. It was this very, very foreign concept to me. So part of my intent here is, in years past, roughly half of the audience, I should say half of the participants in this class, have been like me in terms of having a technical background. And my goal here is to get folks who are in that camp to feel more confident about starting a business. The other side is for those folks who have business experience and not necessarily technical, to really understand the business plan for an entrepreneurial venture is just the first step. Many folks who have business experience working for large companies, when they go and transition to become entrepreneurs, they think that many of the procedures and practices they had in doing work at a large company directly translate. And really, new venture formation does have some unique issues with respect to creating an entity than you would necessarily working for a larger company. And the business plan is, I think, a real critical part of that first step. But really, my goal is for you all to enter the business plan competition like I did, and to kick off what hopefully be a lifetime of entrepreneurship and making impacts, frankly, in the world at large by bringing together business and technology. Right? True to MIT's motto of mind and hands, what I really want to try to do is relate some of the concepts that people might learn academically as theory and really trying to say, okay, well, what's the real hands-on reality of things? So I'm going to try as I go through this lecture. And again, please do funnel your questions in the chat to the TAs. I'm not able to see the chat window while I'm presenting, so the TAs will jump in and read the questions and get my attention to react to things. And either I'll answer them on the spot or put them in a side parking lot to get through if I know I'm going to get to it later. But essentially what I want folks to understand is, again, what I thought would happen back then when we were working on this idea as students, what we thought, what actually happened, and then today, what might I do differently in certain cases, and try to appeal both to the technical and business audience in this classroom. Now, very big disclaimer. Writing a business plan is not a sufficient condition for business success, right? There's a lot of intense work that has to happen when you're doing a startup, probably unlike anything else you might have done if you've never done it before, right? Creating something from nothing and sustaining the team and with the energy and vision and unity that is necessary to succeed is a huge challenge. So I'm writing this as fine print because I think we're all given the Virtual Inc. original business plan as though it's some sort of panacea and template to follow, when in actuality, it's something that hopefully you've been critiquing over the last few days, and that I can tell you a bit what we thought then and what we learned along the way and what we might do differently. All right, a little bit about me. I went to MIT as an undergrad, got my undergrad bachelor's in electrical engineering. I did a master's in computer science, and I left the doctoral program in electrical engineering basically to start Virtual Inc. And I'll tell a story about when I tried to come back and finish. So I'm ABD in that sense. I've also worked for larger technical companies. I worked for HP Medical as an undergrad, HP Labs during graduate work. I worked for Motorola when they had a research center in Cambridge. After a career as an entrepreneur in Boston for about 15 to 20 years, I actually moved down to DC and ended up working for the Department of Defense on a number of really interesting challenges. And after a few years doing that, I was a CTO of a venture capital firm here in Maryland that was investing in mission-proven technologies coming out of the federal government. And now I serve as the CTO of a defense industrial-based startup in the greater DC area. So my background started as an entrepreneur and oddly enough transitioned to be working for government and working also for private sector and private GovCon. So it's very interesting for me to cross these different business sectors and compare and contrast what skills as an entrepreneur have helped me uniquely be successful in a lot of the things that I do. But most importantly for this class, I will cover primarily issues about Virtual Inc., where for the business plan that we submitted 25 years ago, we were a finalist and won $10,000. I went on after Virtual Inc., after doing that for about four years, to do another startup called Newberry Networks, which was funded by the Idea Lab incubator, which had a Boston presence at the time. I went off and started another company called Mach 3, which is now Everyscape, with a student who was in this class when I was lecturing, who approached me after class and asked me if I would help run his company at the time. And I was very intrigued by what he was working on, and we launched the company together. And then I tried to bootstrap some other things and work with some other entrepreneurs. So I have direct entrepreneurial experience working for working with an incubator, venture capital backed stuff where I was the CEO and then CTO, and then frankly angel investing my own money and working with other angel investors to get startups. So I kind of have a fairly good 360 view about what happens in the startup world with tech. And most of this was largely around the Boston area. As I mentioned, part of founding teams for a variety of startups. I've done a lot of work in technology and intellectual property. I do a lot of advising on business and product strategy and technical due diligence. I did a lot of technical diligence when I was a CTO of a venture capital firm in Maryland. I've done some seed state investment myself, but more importantly, I've done well over, frankly, $60 or $70 million in venture capital fundraising across the span of these different companies. So hopefully some of these lessons will translate. So now you know a little bit about me. One of the most difficult things to do virtually, and maybe I can get the TAs and Joe to weigh back in here, was really trying to get a sense of who you are in the audience. And this is very hard to do when you're not in person, kind of asking folks to raise hands. But I definitely would like to get a sense of how many folks are students versus undergrads, which school you're taking the class of, how many of you have a business idea, how many of it's based on research. Maybe some of you have already started a business and you're just getting a shot in the arm from this class and have some specific insights and questions you want to ask. How many of you are investors in the audience? And then a couple other questions, I think, just because I'm curious, since I moved from Boston to DC, how many folks in the class today have been in the military, in the US military? I often find different pockets of entrepreneurial talent and experience when I move from city to city. And I find in the DC area, a lot of folks who are former military who are starting businesses. How many of you are citizens, and how many of you are first or second generation immigrants, which I think is a great thing about being in the US, and that it's a great pipeline and opportunity for folks to really take advantage and make something happen for themselves and leverage the freedoms and liberties that we have in this country. All right, well, if either Joe or some of the TAs could maybe answer some of these questions, that would be great to help me understand in the class. But otherwise, I will just probably press on. How many of you are left-handed? I'm left-handed. We took a poll last time, and I think a good number of the class was actually left-handed. So maybe we'll do a little poll afterwards. All right, so how this all started is actually quite interesting. I was a teaching assistant for a course, an undergraduate laboratory course at MIT called 6111. It's a digital systems electronics lab course. And what we do is we teach principles of digital systems design, automata theory, and so on and so forth during the first 6 weeks of the class. And the next 6 weeks, students propose, design, build, debug, and finally demonstrate a working digital system. And often it's maybe a video game or some sort of quasi-robotics things. And then sometimes they would interface with real-time analog systems like at the time video or as I said, some robotic systems or audio systems, which were outside of the scope of the digital aspect of the course. So when students were doing those kinds of issues, they would sit with TAs. And we as TAs, we had two responsibilities primarily. One was to cut the scope of the projects down because people always wanted to see them build some sort of monstrous supercomputer on their lab kits and try to help them with those things that were outside the scope of the course, which meant going to the whiteboard or chalkboard and working through the schematics and some of the design requirements and working through that all graphically. So it was very, very technical, very graphical, interactive, intensive sessions with students as they propose their design projects. First problem I realized is that students would spend far too much time writing down notes and block diagrams, wiring diagrams, schematics, whatever was being put on the whiteboard as part of the technical discussion with teaching assistants, which meant they were not fully participating in listening during the intellectual exchange with the TAs. The second big problem is because they were taking notes, sometimes they would make mistakes. And because they're not listening critically, they might make an error in transcription and not understand what the thing that they were actually copying down. And then they would build literally their mistake that in terms of the schematic they might have copied or notes they might have taken. And at the end of the class, that translated to literally dozens of wasted hours and stress and frustration for those students. And as I went on teaching 6111 from being a TA to a head TA and then an instructor, I noticed at the end of the class, a big portion of whether or not there was success or failure was the success of these teaching assistant support meetings. And I thought, gee, if we could just get the notes off the board and not worry about copying them so that the students could understand what we're trying to communicate, but have a record of it, this class would be far more enjoyable and far many more students would be able to get their final projects working. So I entered a business plan attempt in the contest a few years before 97. And I wrote this 3-page business plan entitled Transcription System. And I had no prior background in business at all, so I wrote it really as a technical summary. I was a double E, I was a member of IEEE, and I wrote it like an IEEE transactions memo, presenting an idea, and I thought it was self-explanatory and obvious. And the judges literally across the top wrote, nice idea, but where's the business plan? So I went away a little frustrated thinking, well, what do they mean business plan? I've explained to you what the idea is. I've explained to you the impact. What don't you get, right? Well, a lot I didn't get. And I went away a little bit dejected in 94, but I came back and met up with a former classmate of mine from undergrad, Mike Dixon. He was returning as a Sloanie, as an MBA candidate. And we were sitting in a Thirsty Ear pub and having some beers and chatting. And he wanted to enter the contest and was asking me if I had any ideas. And I told him a couple of things that I had attempted, the 3 ideas. And then he said, I like that pen thing. He kept calling it that pen thing. And he said something interesting, which was, let's build a team, write a plan, and enter the contest. And I was like, okay, well, how do we do that, right? And so we did that. And I'll tell a bit about the story, or at least highlights of it. But really, the team, the writing of the plan, and entering the contest is what launched my career for the next 25 years easily in doing entrepreneurship in various forms. So we went on to win $10,000, which at the time felt like $1 million as far as I was concerned as a graduate student in pre Y2K to launch Virtual Ink, and the product was originally called ePen, as you might have seen from the business plan. This is a picture of my graduate dorm room in what was the old Ashdown house, which was on the corner of Mem Drive and Mass Ave. And I had a single room bedroom, and we had converted my dorm room into a lab and assembly area. This is only half side of the room. And I had a futon that I would roll up at night, roll up during the day, and 3 other people would be working in here building prototypes of the original ePen during that summer of 97. And when they would leave at the end of the day, I would roll out my futon, and that was really our company office back in the beginning. So you've probably heard stories from founders back in the throughout the decades about doing stuff in their garage. Well, in my case, it was literally in my dorm room. This lab bench that you see was put out for trash in building 10, I think, at one point, and 4 of us carried it. There's like a 300-pound metal trestle base. We carried it about half a mile from that location to Ashdown House and got it up in the elevator just so that we were scrappy students and just begged, borrowed, didn't steal, but begged and borrowed to get stuff going to build our early prototypes. So back then, the class 6111, this is what students did. They would actually design a digital electronic system and literally wire it all out chip by chip and get a sense for how to build a digital system and then how to wire it together and how to debug it. Today, this is largely replaced with programmable logic. So students, unfortunately, don't get as much experience with understanding the complexities of building a physical system. But this is what it looked like. So I, being a TA for that class, when we went back to the judges in the contest, one of the judges said to us, he said, well, it was a really interesting idea. You won first runner-up, but you didn't win because we just honestly didn't believe you could build it. Well, the lesson is never tell an MIT engineer they can't build something, because I went off basically that weekend and built the electronic prototype of this on the actual lab kits for which we were trying to get students to be able to build their own projects better. So it was an interesting sort of closing of the loop on that front. So yeah, so it was all this first prototype of the system was done this way, and again, being very scrappy students. And we demoed this to some of the judges during that summer and to some early investors, which allowed us to get a little bit more money and to use our 10K winnings to go beyond this classroom prototype. So building the company, as I mentioned, building the team and building the company. So at first I was a TA for 6111. That was the early 90s, many years ago. My fellow grad student buddy, Mike Dixon in 97 wanted us to enter the competition. We won $10,000. We started as 5 guys in a dorm room, literally. Now, the interesting thing is, after winning in the spring of 97, $10,000 and starting to build a business in my dorm room, we started shopping around for other members of the management team who could potentially help us beyond, who were out in the marketplace and might know something about electronic whiteboards. So we had accorded a CEO candidate at the time who had introduced us, who was taking us around to various potential investors and potential partners. And we flew out to California to meet with a company at the time on September 30th, 97. I won't ever forget this. And we were invited out to demo for this company. And turns out they were going to be a direct major competitor. And I'll hit this again later as we go on. Okay. But we took that as a learning experience, that any good idea is probably going to have other folks who have other similar ideas. And so be prepared to enter the marketplace with competition already nipping at your heels. But we successfully raised $1 million from angel investors, from a cohort of angel investors from the West Coast predominantly a few months later. We used that $1 million to build a very basic prototype in 5 months. And then from there, we raised $5 million from what was the time called CMGI, their Adventures 3, their third fund. CMGI was essentially the original internet investor out of Boston that invested in what was Alta Vista, which was the search engine way before Google and Yahoo. Had invested in a number of really interesting internet properties at the time. And before really the center of gravity for internet investing had moved out to the West Coast. So we raised $5 million from them. We were the only hardware product company in their portfolio. We raised money from IDG Ventures, a follow-on round to basically ramp up our production. And then we launched Mimeo in 97 and ahead of our competitor. Sorry, hang on. Sorry about that. So now I'll tell the story about what happened with our major competitor. We went out there, we were invited by the VP of marketing for electronics for imaging at the time to come out in September of 97 and demonstrate what we were talking about. And so we fly out there. I made sure that we had a mutual NDA in place before we went out there. And I flew out there, Mike, my business partner at the time, and a CEO candidate that we were courting. And we flew out there and we met with the VP of marketing and we did our little pitch. And all I had brought with me were these mock-up blocks that we stuck on the whiteboard and mocked up what the electronic sleeve would look like. And if there's questions about what the device is, I think everyone understands what it is, but if not, the TAs let me know and I can describe a bit more about what Mimeo is and how it works and maybe show a little video. But essentially Mimeo, what we had envisioned would be a device, an ultrasonic-based tracking system that would be affixed to the whiteboard. And then you would have a little electronic sleeve that would transmit a signal that would be detected by this tracking device on the whiteboard. And as you wrote with the marker pen in that sleeve, this device would triangulate the position of this pen and transcribe it to a personal computer in real time. So again, this is late 90s, before cell phones really were as pervasive as they are today. So there was really no easy way to capture the stuff, and I'll hit that on the next page. Anyway, we're walking through the pitch for what we had planned with Virtual Ink with the VP of marketing. And he says, this is really great stuff. Would you guys wait while I go grab the CEO and see if he's free to come down and meet with you guys? So we're like, yeah, sure. That's fantastic. So he leaves the room. We're all excited. It's just me. I'm a grad student, my other colleague, MBA, and the CEO candidate. We're going to meet with the CEO of, at the time, this $500 million a year revenue company that makes the color laser copier engines for high-speed color laser copiers. And the idea was, all right, well, since we're capturing the virtual ink off the whiteboard, we might partner with companies who might do processing of that kind of thing. And so the folks that we're looking to are maybe printer companies or other folks who can convert that virtual ink back to paper for folks to be able to use and distribute. So the CEO comes down and we go through our pitch again. And very stern fellow, kind of looked at us very seriously. And we do our pitch, and he says, okay, well, that's all well and good. And he started asking questions, and he says, well, guys, we actually have this working already. And we looked, my team, we looked at each other kind of puzzled. Like, what do you mean? He says, yeah, we actually have our own version of this, and it's on the board in the next room if you want to see it. And I said, well, no, thank you. I don't want to see any of your product offerings. We were here to just sort of see if you'd be partners with what we're doing. So the CEO starts asking questions about how we intended to solve various technical challenges in building our product. And it became clear as he was asking us questions that there were some key things that they hadn't figured out yet. So in the early version, in the design of this thing, building the triangulating unit that gets put on the upper part of the whiteboard had its own challenges, but making the stylus so that it was powered long enough without having and the timing signal between these things so that you didn't need to have a wire between the two was actually a fairly interesting, challenging problem at the time with the technology available to solve. But we had solved that problem. We had a pathway to solving that problem. And it became clear as he was asking questions that they had not quite done so yet. So even though we're meeting with a $500 million a year revenue company, and we're being, if you will, told that we're behind, we're able to do we're able to sort of understand that maybe they weren't as far along as they wanted to be. So at this point, the CEO says, look, we are a very powerful company. We will, any market space we decide to enter, we dominate and crush all the competitors. If you guys are going to enter this space, it'd be your best interest to frankly sell us whatever tech you have and exit the marketplace because we'll crush you. Okay.
Yonald,
yes?
Sorry if I jump in. We have two questions.
Yes, please.
The first is from the chat, and is Vasil asking why you said no to his offer to see their version.
Okay. So what I was concerned about was, even though we had a mutual NDA in place, this was a fairly large company. And if I had seen anything that might have been an enabling, that might have given me ideas about how to build my product, which wasn't completely finished yet, I didn't want to be accused of taking any of their ideas, right? So I was fine having a conversation in the bounds of the NDA in this meeting, but I didn't want to see what they had because I knew that would raise the stakes for me for potentially being sued for saying I stole their idea, okay? And there was another question?
Yes, there's another question. Ravi has his hand up. Ravi, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be simpler to have a bunch of cameras at different angles and get what is written on the whiteboard?
Well, that's easy to say today, 25 years later, but cameras were not at all affordable back then.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right? So we take for granted today that every cell phone we have has a pressure sensor, has essentially a thermometer, has 3 cameras on it, has a LiDAR sensor. Back then, 97, was when cell phones were frankly just starting to hit mainstream consumer markets. Cameras were not as small, the optics were not as good, and the idea really was to convert the writing surface to, and I'll hit this on the next slide, the solutions that were envisioned then because of limitations and cost of the technology. But yes, today it's obvious, we just take a picture. But back then, that was not at all the case. So,
thank you.
Yep. Any other questions quickly while I'm paused?
Yes, Amy has a few questions. Amy, just turn on your mic and go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I was just curious, did you research about their innovation before you go out there? What was your goal, trying to achieve with your presentation?
Yes, so we saw ourselves, if I were to think about the value we were creating, we were now taking physical ink off a whiteboard and making it virtual ink. And the idea was, where can that virtual ink be used, right? It could be used to collaborate. It could be used to communicate. It could be used to synthesize and convert things into hand-drawn pictures, perhaps into cleaned up drawings. And so we saw this partner as part of the communication channel, either that we could take our device and have a driver that would go to printers, and maybe they could be someone who would help us print these images, because they were emerging as a leader for corporate printing and corporate publishing. So again, it was really sort of an exploratory meeting to see if we could form some partnerships that would then allow us to turn around the investment community and say, hey, there are folks who are interested in doing what we're doing. We had no idea at all, because they had not been public about their intent to enter this market space either. Okay.
So they have something in the more like a larger general space.
I'll show you. I'll show a picture of what they had envisioned,
okay.
and what our why in this particular case patents were really interesting. Okay. All right. If there are no other questions, I'll continue.
Please continue. Continue.
Okay, great. So the CEO, as I mentioned, says he's got it in the other room. I don't want to look at it, and starts asking some questions. And I realized that they still had not gotten past some technical hurdles that we had at the time, right? So I start asking some questions, and I start, and his answer is, oh yeah, we've solved that. And I thought he was dismissing my questions a little too easily. So I start making up problems to sort of test if he really knows what he's talking about. So I start making up problems about, oh, well, when the sun is coming in the window, it heats up part of the whiteboard. And if you have an air vent, you have temperature differentials, and with the ultrasound. And he's like, oh yeah, we've solved all that problems. Our thing works great. So I realized, okay, so they're not being completely transparent on their end. I get it. That's fine. So at the end, he says, this is when he makes a statement about, frankly, they're being very litigious and very dominant when they enter the marketplace, and that if they decide to make us an offer, it would be in our best interest to just accept it and leave. So at this point, I say, a week ago, I was in a lab at MIT working on doctoral work. And this week, I'm here sitting across from you, an extremely successful Silicon Valley CEO, $500 million revenue business. And honestly, I don't know what next week's going to bring, but I'm having a great time. My whole team is having a great time. Tell you what, we'll just shake. May the best team win. And good luck to you. Good luck to your team. Thank you for giving us time. And hope to see you in the future. That kind of thing. So we leave the meeting, and my business one of my first business partner and our CEO candidate were in the parking lot, and they are terrified. They're like, oh my goodness, this company, they've been working at this. I have no idea how many engineers and what they've done. And, we're dead. And I said, no, they're about a year behind in production. And I explained what I thought technically. And I said, in those questions I asked, I made up those questions, and he didn't, I don't believe that they are where quite they are. So we start laughing, and our cell phone rings, which was like this big brick. And it was the VP of marketing who calls us a few minutes later and says, hey, Yonald, I'm really sorry. I know I got you out here potentially on false pretenses. We wanted to learn more about your company and what you were doing. I'm sorry I wasn't totally transparent with you. But listen, I'm calling from the parking lot. He was on the other side of the parking lot where we were. And he says, when you guys left, the CEO threw a fit. No one has ever talked to him that way before. No one has ever turned down an offer. No one has ever said to him, have a nice day. We're going to have a great time, and leave. And the CEO is like, why can't I find engineers who are that fearless to make sure that our products are going to succeed in the marketplace? So I tell this story not to pat myself on the back, but just to understand every communication in business is kind of a dance. And you don't know what's going to be actually told honestly, even in the context of having NDAs in place and shared. But if you know what you're doing in this game well, there's a sense of confidence that you need to be able to project, because that often makes the difference, right? So the VP of marketing on the phone told me that story about the CEO. Then he said, the next sentence was amazing. He says, listen, I'm actually leaving EFI in a week. I want to help you raise your first round of money, because I've got about 5 people I know who would put money in you and in a team like this that's going to go and build this business. So even though we went to EFI thinking we'd meet a partner, that first pitch, we met someone who introduced us to that first $1 million of angel money that came in about 6, 7 months time, right? So every meeting you go into, don't necessarily expect to get out what you thought you might get out of it transactionally when you go in. It could completely morph and evolve into something you have no idea, right? And that's happened in my career a number of times where I'll meet with someone and someone else, that person invites someone else, and things just snowball and take on a life of their own. So opportunities are where you frankly seek them and create them, is the lesson for this part of the building the company. And as you saw, that first $1 million allowed us to raise another 5, another 4, and then things get crazy, and I'll hit that story a little later. Okay, so this goes back, I think it was to Ravi who asked the question about the whiteboards. And at the time, cameras were frankly not high resolution enough. Those that were prohibitively expensive. There was no, today we take for granted that, we have technology that could fuzz my background and still overlay my animated hands here and me in the foreground. None of this stuff would have run, 25 years ago. What you had were these big, clunky electronic whiteboards that I have on the slides here, right? These copy boards like the Panasonic Panaboard, which at the time was $2,000 to $3,000, and would print out on thermal fax paper in black and white. Or you had something like the Softboard, the second one there, which was built by a company called Microfield Graphics, and what they had were lasers. You would put on the tip of the pen a little barcode, and there were lasers that would scan back and forth and triangulate the position of that pen. That was one of the most accurate ones, but extremely expensive, prone to calibration errors. At the far right was a product by Xerox that was developed originally at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And it was called Liveboard. And Xerox, as you know, probably has done a ton more innovation than a number of other companies for decades in the Silicon Valley area, but was unable to really recoup a lot of that. Anyway, they had this entire interactive digital whiteboard system called Liveboard, which was a rear projection TV, which at the time was tens of thousands of dollars with an integrated touchscreen and a lot of other software that they built. So again, that was impractical for the average consultant or business user to take. So all these things were large, big physical whiteboards. And I was like, no. I want to retrofit something. I want to take the surface that you have and make that a digital surface without having you to actually buy so that was part of the pitch here, right? Is that I can take something and I could make your 10-foot whiteboard be an electronic whiteboard. You'll notice none of these boards are, Panasonic Panaboard, I think was 4 feet, Softboard was 3 feet, Smartboard was maybe 4 feet, and Liveboard was 4 feet. We were able to do 8-foot whiteboards and make them electronic for $500, right? That was our retail goal, which undercut everyone here commercially in terms of what they could do. All right, so, and I mentioned the story about EFI being a direct competitor, and they were very litigious with anyone who even went after their core patents. So for Virtual Ink, meeting that potential partner who ended up being a competitor in EFI really turned me on to the idea that, okay, because this particular adversary has identified themselves in the marketplace, I need to have my ducks in a row from an intellectual property perspective. And IP strategy would be critical and core to what I'm doing. Now, for all of you as entrepreneurs starting out, that may not be your experience, right? You may not have to file aggressively in patents. And I'm going to tell a little bit about patent stories. And what I don't want you to come away with is thinking, oh, patents are must for his business. But the lesson is to have a strategy about how to build your intellectual property and how to protect it, right? And then frankly, how to convince investors that you do have adequate intellectual property strategy to, can you build it? Can you defend it? Can you continue to innovate on it? Are critical questions that investors are going to want to see as you go forward. So I believe you've probably covered most of this in the past, but since I talked about meeting that first company and having an NDA in place, for some of you, I just wanted to hit what I thought were critical documents that you might want to have in your mind if you're going to be building a business and need to do. First of all, incorporate. If you're not incorporated as an entrepreneur and starting a business, you need to. And getting incorporated in the United States is a very straightforward prospect handled at the state level. You need a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. That's the only, and they could be, I think 2 of those roles can be the same depending on which state. Very simple. Often it's a couple $100. you want to hire an attorney to draft up the articles of incorporation and an operating agreement, you know, you could spend a few $100s, but overall it should cost you significantly less than $1,000 to get that done. Most companies, when you start, because the state of Delaware has a good amount of corporate law, most people will try to either set up as a Delaware LLC or Delaware S Corp before any significant financing event happens. If you wait too long to incorporate and then you take money, then the share price for when you incorporated to when you actually took the event, when you incorporate, that window is too narrow and can lead to either tax complications in the future or other issues. So incorporate sooner the better, just to put some time between you and any particular financing event, so that you don't trigger any other sort of scrutiny or issues unnecessarily. Now, once you're incorporated, you're going to want to get some things in place between you and your founders. If you're developing intellectual property, excuse me, that intellectual property, investors are going to expect it to be assigned to the company. So if you're an individual inventor, you're going to have to negotiate with your founders about getting some of that rights to that intellectual property assigned to the company. Everyone's going to have to sign confidentiality agreements and non-compete agreements. And I know, you know, those are largely not enforceable in California, and they're still seen in Massachusetts. But non-competes are necessary for founding teams, because sometimes the people who start that company, even a few months later, aren't the ones that end up raising money. People leave, people get added. You want to make sure people, if they leave on good terms, everything's good. If they leave on bad terms, that they don't try to compete with whatever it is you're trying to get done. Also, you want to make it clear what compensation amongst the founders is going to be, if any, right? If you're going to be all doing sweat equity and someone thinks they're going to get money in exchange of doing their work, you want to clarify all those issues up front. And that can be a couple grand to get started. When I was doing this, thankfully, there's a lot of resources around MIT. You could probably find templates for some of this stuff. Certainly for IP assignment and confidentiality and non-competes. But I would recommend doing it through an attorney. And if you go through the contest and do well, you'll often be able to find attorneys who will defer some fees on some of this thing until you do get financing. When you do take financing in, there are going to be restricted stock agreements for the common shareholders, which are usually the original founders and insiders at the time. And they're going to want to see some amount of the entrepreneurs having skin in the game, which means that you hold yourselves to a very high standard about earning the equity that you've already earning the equity in a way that holds you accountable. So sometimes you'll see some sort of time-based vesting. You own the stock, but it's restricted and vested back to you. So you might own some block of stock as a founder, but you might see a restricted stock agreement at some point being asked by your investors at some point, where they say over 4 years, you will vest your 100% of your stock ownership, not 100% of the stock of the company, but what you own 100%. But maybe they might ask for a 1-year cliff, which means for the first year, if you leave in the first year, you get nothing. But afterwards, 1 year and a day, you get 25. And there's some vesting schedule all the way to 100% of what your original stock allotment would be. Usually it's vesting monthly. And if there's a purchase event in the company, then that triggers an acceleration of your vesting to 100% on either an acquisition or an IPO kind of thing. And then they're also going to want to see all sorts of rights that restrict, who can invest, who can participate, can other investors piggyback on various things, and so on. And then last, as I mentioned, non-disclosure agreements, employment agreements, and contract agreements, because chances are you may not have enough money, and you might have NDAs and contract agreements so that folks will work in exchange for some equity piece, in which case you want to get that really well defined and very well clarified. So these are kind of the essentials, right? For a few $1,000s to safeguard your hard work in setting up a company and your company long term, it's definitely worth it. Okay. Any questions? There usually is a ton of questions here, and I'll take a few if there are any.
We have a question in the chat. is by Amy, and she's asking if you can sign an employment agreement without paying the person as an employee.
That would go to compensation, and so you could perhaps pay them in stock. And again, I want to make, I'm not an attorney on this, so you want to make sure that you've got proper legal advice on this. But the compensation doesn't have to be cash, right? It could be equity, it could be options, it could be, well, if it's options, that actually does trigger, it might actually trigger something. But you can offer common stock potentially. You could offer future revenue. You could do deferred, delayed payment. There are a number of compensations that you could work with someone. Maybe the person just wants to license what you're doing. I had a contractor who worked with us who just wanted to be able to use us as a referral for other work, and that they could use what they built for us for another customer. And because it was fairly limited, we signed off on that. Right, so they wanted to be able to say they had done some startup experience, and because we were doing well and our name was known, they wanted to piggyback on that. So yes, it doesn't have to be purely cash. There are other forms of compensation. Again, this might vary state to state, and I don't want to lead you afoul of any SEC regulations with respect to stock, but I know that you can do that as well. Another question?
Okay, now we have a live question. Samid, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? For a lot of these things that we've talked about in this class and in previous ones, it seems that for somebody who hasn't done it before, it seems like almost an insurmountable, it just seems like so much work of like, where do you even begin? And there just seems like 1,000 different places where you can go wrong. For like a first-time founder or somebody who's new to this process, what's like the best way to be organized and to, make sure you don't really miss anything major, and like what's a good guidance in that nature too?
Are you saying with respect to the legal issues or?
Yeah, legal issues, and just from the very onset of your time from starting the company at MIT, making sure it's secure IP, talking about you probably have to set up a business plan. Like there's just so many small steps along the journey where I feel like if you've done it before, it could be simpler, but for the first time, it seems almost impossible.
It does seem daunting, but I assure you, as you jump into entrepreneurship, within a month, you'll know all these terms and you'll know all the parameters on a lot of this stuff. And I will hit some references, some texts that I would as recommended reading. And I'll hit this point at the end, but I'll make it now because you bring it up, and I don't want to dismiss it. One of the critical things when you're starting a company like this is to get mentors and advisors, right? People who've been around the block and are going to ask you these questions and say, hey, Samid, are you incorporated yet? Hey, do you have these documents in place? Have you done this? Have you done that, right? Anyone who's an entrepreneur who's been around the block and done this a few times, they're going to have in their mind that checklist is going to be obvious. And for you, you're going to be like, oh, okay, I get it. Now I know why I need this. And this is my next hurdle, my next hurdle. So, and then you don't do this all the time. But as you also start to talk to other peers, and you yourself will no doubt do mentoring as well as an entrepreneur to share your triumphs and headaches. People will ask you and guide you through some of these major signpost things that you need to get done. And these are just boilerplate things that you need to get done to make sure you're not running afoul of yourself, for one, your team, because teams can evolve, as I said, over time, but definitely getting mentors, definitely getting advisors. I think there's a number of organizations in and around MIT that the class has already probably referred to that's really helpful. For where you can get mentorship where ethically they don't involve themselves in taking any equity in what you're doing. And I think going on, it's harder in the age of COVID, but, going to these networking events and trying to network other folks to find other peers and other entrepreneurs and other former entrepreneurs as mentors or potential advisors are absolutely key.
Well, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay. One more question, if there is one. Anyone?
Okay, we have a few more in the chat, but can some of the first, and then we'll see if there is time. So this is from Wasil. He's asking, how restrictive do VCs usually get in stopping you from getting funding from a specific investor that they might not like?
That's a good question. I'll ask you to remind me of that question later when I go through the financial story. Because putting together a syndicated round is also another dance, right? Getting investor A and investor B to play nice with one another if they either don't have a history of doing so, or they don't have aligned interests in some way, right? I have a chart that shows fundraising for another company I did, and I talk a little bit about that. But so I'll defer that question. Make sure, please, that you ask me again when I get to the bar chart about fundraising time.
Okay. Okay, so Wasil just present your question later, and we go with another question from Jahavi. He's asking, how can we develop an IP portfolio before raising money, given that filing patents cost a lot?
Okay. I read my mind. That'll be the next slide. I'm going to jump into things you can do from a patent perspective, where I'd recommend it and where I wouldn't recommend it. So I'll jump that in a second. So if there's another question, hold that thought. It'll be the next slide.
Okay, now the question is, what are rights of first refusal and piggyback rights?
So that has to do with, and again, first refusal is, if I want to sell my stock, let's say I'm a founder and I want to leave because I don't have the, I don't want to be in the company anymore. Or I have, whatever reason I want to leave, and I have equity. You may want to make sure that that equity comes back to the company for a pre-negotiated price, right? Or that the company has the right to buy that stock first before I go and sell it to some other third party, right? So the idea is that when you're founding a company, what you don't want is a portion of your cap table, your capitalization table, that is, who are the equity holders in the company, to not, you want to be able to control that in some way. And so for those folks that have stock, to the extent that you can, say, look, you want to leave? Great. We have the right first to buy you out. You might have negotiated a price, or you might be the first one in line to negotiate a price. That's what that has. And piggyback rights allow investors to potentially buy into that round as well. So if the stock is being sold, they may have rights to be able to participate in that purchase as well. Okay. And piggyback rights also has other implications for preferred stock investors in other rounds later. Okay. But at this stage, I'm really talking about a founder who leaves. What happens to their stock, right? If you haven't put a vesting schedule in, do they leave with 25 or 50% of the company? What do you do, right? Well, you have to buy them out, and you may want to pre-negotiate what that looks like, right? And you may want to be the one that buys them out first before they try to transfer it to someone else. Okay. Another question?
Not for now.
Okay, great. All right. So I'll quickly hit. Let me quickly hit one more thing here. These are related to really investment things. So investments can take different forms, right? They can take an equity purchase for common stock, an equity purchase of preferred stock. Sometimes it could just be a loan that converts to stock, right? And those are convertible promissory notes, right? So a loan that converts to stock, when you're an entrepreneur starting out, can be very useful, because writing all the documentation with actually issuing stock is a fairly expensive legal process to get going. As you see below here, right, preferred stock to do what would be called your first round of financing of preferred stock, Series A, could be several $1,000s to do, right? If you're able to get a promissory note instead, which could be basically 2 pages, maybe cost a few hours of attorney time to draft, keep it simple. A promissory note says, this is the amount that's being loaned, this is the term, the interest rate, the discount rate, which is, okay, when the note converts, when my loan converts to stock, what is the discount rate? So for example, if I got $100,000 as a promissory note, and that note converts with 5% interest, and then per year, and then maybe my $100,000 lets me buy $150,000 worth of stock at some valuation at the end of that time limit, right? So what's nice about a promissory note is you maybe have half a dozen terms that you could very quickly negotiate with an angel investor, get a promissory note, sign it, and have money transferred very quickly, versus a fairly protracted process for doing a much larger round through preferred stock. Right? But anyway, promissory notes. Now, if you're talking with a professional investor, generally the way that you engage is you'll have a term sheet which lays out many parameters with regard to the stock offering itself. And it takes weeks to negotiate that. And it has all sorts of clauses and terms that try to give it's called preferred because in the event that the company is either sold or has to end up being liquidated, the investors get their money out first. They get the opportunity to recoup their investment first. So, which means often for the common stockholders, there may not be anything left if the company goes belly up, and the preferred stockholders may get pennies on the dollar if things go badly, right? So, but even negotiating a term sheet for what would later be a preferred stock round takes a couple grand because you got to itemize all those different terms. And a term sheet could be, 8 to 10 pages of legalese, and getting that right and having an attorney. You may want to draft your term sheet if you're in a position to do so and give it to investors, but sometimes investors will give you a term sheet of their own and you need to pay for legal review and negotiate each of those clauses, okay? Setting up, as I said, the stock, the preferred stock, there are a lot of corporate documents you need to get done for due diligence, right? Because the investor is going to want to see, okay, what do your books look like? Let me see all the corporate documents for incorporation, your bank statements, any contracts, all that. Once the term sheet's accepted and signed, you kick off all this due diligence. And then at some point, you set up a time for when the actual funding event and wire transfer is going to occur. And then some other legal expenses, you're going to have to put together some sort of employee incentive plan, which could be a stock option plan. And I'll talk a little bit about that. All right, quick questions here because I do want to hit the patent question that I was asked earlier. Any questions on these?
No question.
Great. All right, so patents, whoops, hang on a second here. There we go. So I don't want to belabor this because I think there's been some discussion, if I'm not mistaken, about patents. Now, for our company, patents were essential, as I mentioned, because we were building a physical device, an electronic device, and we knew we had a very litigious competitor that made huge investments in building their patent portfolio. And in years past, I don't have it here, unfortunately, but Joe had a patent reference diagram that showed the patents that we filed at Virtual Ink, how many hundreds of people have since linked to it because we did such thorough background work on pen computing, on electronic whiteboards, on Virtual Ink, that it's become kind of this wall that people have to all beat their heads around to try to get around to go past, even though now some of these patents have since expired in the last couple of years. But anyway, what's great about a patent is that it is essentially a state-issued exclusive right that prevents others from making, using, selling, importing on an invention where you disclose, you disclose how to make how to reduce something to practice. Now, a patent has to have at least three components, right? It's got to be novel, it's got to be new, it's got to be inventive. That is, it's non-obvious to someone who's sufficiently practiced in that particular field, and useful. It actually has to be. You actually have to be able to build it. No perpetual motion machines, nothing like that. But you have to be able to build it. It's got to be new, and it's got to be non-obvious to people in that particular field. Now, whether you go for patents or not, patents for us were an important part of the intellectual property portfolio strategy and story, because our investors wanted to know, can you build this without infringing on someone else's patents, right? So I spent literally 5 weeks on the internet researching. I must have read at the time 300 and something patents, looking at pen computing and digital whiteboards and triangulation and all these different areas. And what was interesting about doing that was I really got a good understanding of where the state of the art was and where there was an opportunity for us to control some of the intellectual property landscape and prevent other people going forward in the future. So I knew others would be looking at the patent landscape too, and I wanted to make it harder for those people. So it was, I wanted to use patents as a barrier to entry to who might be any competitors following us. And because we're a small company, if we're able to get patents on critical things, it would make it harder for even companies like EFI that were known for building very strong portfolios from being able to go after us. Okay. Someone said, all right, well, patents are really expensive. So what you might want to look at are what are called provisional patents. In the United States, there's what's called a provisional patent where you don't have all the detailed filing requirements that you have for a full patent, right? So there's a fairly inexpensive fee. I'm not sure that it's still $80. You don't have to have all claims. You don't have to do a very detailed prior art search as you do in patents. You don't have to have it translated in other languages. And what happens is a provisional patent lets you essentially mark today is, let's say you file a provisional patent today, you have essentially 1 year with which to file a full utility patent application referring to this prior provisional patent filing date as your priority date, as the date of your actual invention. So basically, it allows you to fix in time with some nominal amount of disclosure what your invention is until you actually can get all your claims and prior art stuff done within a year, right? So provisional patents let you have, they can allow you to have somewhat meaningful conversations with potential investors as you prepare your claims portfolio, your claims for and the rest of the patent portfolio as well. The disadvantage of filing them is that if you hastily prepare a provisional patent, it might not have sufficient breadth and scope to include your subsequent utility application, because your utility application has to materially be derived from stuff that you claim in your provisional patent earlier, right? The other thing too is sometimes these provisional patents, they're made public after a year or so, and so foreign authorities might disqualify some claims issues in their filings. I would recommend that you talk to a patent attorney if this is still a concern. This was a concern years ago, but some of these things may have been loopholes that have since been closed. Okay. All right. So, sorry. Here we go. So, right now, for us at Virtual Inc., over that year, I filed, I think, 10 or 12 patents, 3, 6, 9, something like that, right? Basically, every month, I was taking some critical element of the system and filing a patent for it. And some of these are the first one is essentially overall the system description. The other one is the system description being used in assembly. The other one had to do with the physical embodiment of things. Some of it had to do with the manipulation of the virtual ink they would capture. One of them had to do with the actual apparatus. There's an ultrasound welding apparatus, and I'll describe that in a second. And also how we chose to build this particular device. The welding apparatus is actually pretty important. In the stylus, so the marker pen would go in the electronic sleeve that we created. And at the tip of that sleeve, there was a circular ultrasonic transmitter that we custom built. And the way that that custom transmitter was built is that we would take an ultrasonic material, we would wrap it around a round mandrel, and then it would be welded together. And we went to a company that provides this material and the welding machine, and we asked them, well, how do you actually do these welds? Because the weld would create a dead spot in terms of transmission of signal. And so we wanted to make sure that our transmitter, looking at it top down, was transmitting evenly all around, so that whenever the person was holding the pen or turning the pen, we had good signal. So we asked them how they would build it, and they explained to us that the hammer that comes down and does the welding and the welding surface were removable and they were interchangeable. So we designed a hammer and a hammer receptacle on the ring that they would use when they folded that, when they made that material for us to build our custom sensor. Fast forward, EFI tested, they bought, when it hit in the marketplace, they bought a Mimeo and found out and reverse engineered or spoke to the vendor, because there were only 2 vendors, I think, for this material. And the vendor said, oh yeah, we make that sensor, we'll sell you some. Well, we went back to the vendor and said, no, you can't. You can't sell them our material because we have a patent on that weld. You can't use our welding process for another competitor. So even though we didn't own the machine, we owned that little one piece they put in the machine that made that highly uniform sensor for us, custom, and that blocked EFI from having a superior product for another year, right? So each thing here in our patent portfolio was geared to protecting the system or a critical component in that system that we knew that if a competitor had access to, it would be a competitive advantage. So each thing that we thought was a competitive advantage or a competitive in the critical path of developing the product or using the product, we try the patent. Okay. So, in summary, our IP strategy was file lots of patents, both offensively and defensively. Offensively, in that we were trying to claim future landscape in terms of how virtual ink might be used, and defensively in terms of things that we were going to be building in the first version of the product. For us, patenting all technology bottlenecks, including that manufacturing, the use of the ink, and so on, was very critical. As I mentioned there. We try to patent different embodiments of the invention, which I'll hit in a bit as well. So one of the things we did early on is we had, once we made your regular surface essentially a digital writing surface, we included in the box little decals that you could stick to the whiteboard. And one of the decals was a calculator. So it was literally just a sheet of paper, but you hit a button on the Minio and you would calibrate the position of that calculator. And when you would touch that area of the whiteboard with the pen, it would read numbers back to you so you can do calculator work at the whiteboard without having to go to the computer. So the idea of creating active touch surfaces on the whiteboard was one of the things we patented. So you can imagine one of the things that we did is we had a piano keyboard, and people could play the piano up there on the keyboard and write music on the whiteboard, but play the piano on the whiteboard without having to go back, right? So we were thinking of new ways to make the ad hoc writing suddenly useful for interactive media, for making it an interactive media surface with other capabilities as well. Because we patented that, after we released that, EFI also included a calculator in the product. When our patent was issued, we told EFI, we have a patent on this. You can't do this exactly the same way we did. So it became very frustrating for EFI, but because basically, every other month we're sending them a letter saying that what they're doing in their product is essentially covered in our patent strategy and our patents, and that they're potentially infringing. Right? We also patented, once we patented in the US, we patented in Europe and Japan, which were going to be our initial key overseas markets as well. Okay? That was part of our strategy. And this gets progressively more expensive, but starting at provisional patents, US patents, and overseas patents, that was part of our strategy to go overall. One other thing in our patents is we try to get very quantitative, right? So rather than just being, describing the system overall, we would say better than or at least as good as so-and-so, so that someone would have to meet or exceed that threshold if the current state-of-the-art technology is there as well. Right, so then the other thing I would also do is I would try to assume when my patent is published, how would I defend what comes after it next, right? So trying to anticipate what might be future things was also part of our patent strategy. Now, the other thing too we did was we use our patent portfolio in market positioning, and I'll hit that next. Is there a question out there?
Yes, we have a live question from Ravi.
Okay, let's, I'll pause here and take a question. Take questions, sorry.
You have all these patents on this slide and the ones before. And as Joe mentioned in his talk, these things cost lots and lots of money.
Right.
At what stage of your raising the money did you file all these patents, and how much did it cost you at that time?
Great question. So I broke it up into 3 large phases. When we were raising money, everyone wanted to know, can we build this product? And they didn't necessarily doubt that we could build it electronically, but could we build it without infringing? So phase 1 was to do what we call a freedom to operate study, where you go off and you read a bunch of patents and you explain how your product approach either doesn't need or gets around all the prior patents that are out there in this particular field. That was phase 1, writing our freedom to operate study. Phase 2 is once we raise a little money, and maybe part of phase 1 also, we filed a couple provisional patents right away, right? In fact, we did this as students before we went on stage in the contest and filed a provisional patent for what we called EPEN at the time, just to make sure that our public disclosure on stage for the contest wouldn't invalidate a future patent filing. That was a few $100s at most of work. And we continue to do some of that going forward. That would be phase 1 to phase 2 kind of things, right? Provisional patents. Phase 3 on the IP strategy is when we finally got investment money in. Now, part of my job as a CTO was strategically making sure that that we defended our territory by filing patents. And then at that point, when we had money, we hired patent attorneys who worked with us, and I was principally involved in authoring all those patents myself. Now, that may not be the case for entrepreneurs out there, right? But if you have a technology co-founder, I would say that a big part of their responsibility is to strategically look at the intellectual property position. What is it? How do you grow it? How do you defend it? How do you keep innovating it? Is going to be a key issue going forward. So really, again, can I build this? A study, which is usually going to be done on the internet, and maybe with some, maybe with some legal review, filing provisionals, and then filing once you've got some actual money a bit more. Now, again, it's hard to do this virtually because in the class, I would see a show of hands of how many people are building a physical product. If you're building an actual product, I would say patent strategy will probably 2/3 of the time be important to what you're doing. If you're doing anything in biotech, you absolutely need to do something in this space. And I'll hit this as a roundup question later. Any other quick questions on this?
Thank you.
Yep.
We have one more question from Stephanie. Stephanie?
Sorry, I just had a question regarding the international patents. You say that in the key markets of US, Europe, and Japan, you expanded, well, you started in the US, but
yep.
How did you manage the kind of that time crunch of that provisional patent, getting the claims, and doing your research and development, and still being within that time frame and managing also too, the requirements for those markets internationally in the IP?
Yep, it's a great question. So Japan was important. In Europe, we filed first in the UK. So, and again, always consult with an attorney, but at the time, we had filed in the US. And when you file in the US, you have usually through what was called the PCT, the Paris Patent Cooperation Treaty, you have about a year to file internationally, and then, which is your PCT application, and then to go into specific countries. So there's a well-defined process that can take 2 to 3 years from when you first have your provisional to when you actually start filing in all these countries. And in each country, as we develop our with respect to the US, our overseas marketing plan, we factored in the filings for that to protect us so that, again, a US competitor might try to go overseas in a market that we want to play in, and that they wouldn't be able to saturate that market before we got there. So, yes, it was part of our market strategy. The marketing strategy and the market strategy very much dovetail with the IP strategy to know what territories we want to defend and ideally lock out other competitors from trying to come in. And there's a sequencing of that. You've got to file in the US first, you've got to file your PCT, and then you file in those countries afterwards. And it does get progressively more expensive. So you can't file everywhere. You're going to have to be judicious as a small company about where to file. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Great. All right. And again, there'll be nuances depending on what kind of business you're in. But in our case, as a consumer-oriented electronics product that had some pretty difficult technology components that had to be custom built, it wasn't a slam dunk for people to try to rip us off, even if they could build the stuff, because the materials, the manufacturing process, and how the whole system worked together was not at all obvious, even with the patents disclosed. All right. So the last bullet I had down here was using your patent portfolio in market positioning. And this is a slightly different thing. Again, remember when I started off and I started saying that you may intend for a certain meaning to have a certain purpose, but sometimes that contact ends up being very different than what you think. Such was also the case for intellectual property strategy. And I would say for anything you do in the context of your business, any hours you invest strategically, finding cross-fertilization within the company of those efforts to see how they might inform other parts of the business is really key. And this is an example. So as Chief Technology Officer for Virtual Inc. and co-founder, again, I mentioned that most of my effort was very focused on making sure we had a solid patent strategy. And I was discussing with our business development vice president one day what we were doing. And the first patent came back in August 8th of 2000. And, you know, it listed the inventors and all this stuff. And I was very proud. It was my first patent. And it listed all the other patent applications that were pending at the time, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So off the bat, someone who sees this patent sees I've got 6 coming right behind this. So good luck, right? Now, our VP of Business Development pointed out that the cover of our patent application, the figure that the patent office chose to put on the cover, showed an early embodiment of the ePen system where we had one sensor in the upper left corner and one sensor in the upper right corner, and the stylus would transmit, and those waves would propagate out, and each sensor would triangulate to the pen, and that would give us the position of the pen on the board. Well, we realized that though this is technically correct, when we went to market with a different embodiment where the 2 sensors were packaged together in one device that was mounted in the upper left section of the whiteboard. The reason being is that if it were in the same hardware packaging, that distance would be fixed and known versus the embodiment that we also protected in the patent where the user could have varying distance. Varying distance required some calibration to figure out what that distance was. But we patented both. We patented the varying distance one, and we patented the fixed bar system. When EFI went to market, their product looked exactly like this diagram, which I never saw their product. No one on the team actually saw their product when they went to market. And this goes back to, I think it was our first or second question. Why didn't I want to see it? I didn't know. I had a bad feeling about it. I didn't want to know what they built, but that's what they built and that's what they went to market. And we had completely independently built. Our first prototype was that. Our market prototype was not. And now our business development vice president said, you know what? We're going to use this and we're going to go affect the competitor's market position. So when you sell retail electronics products, when you sell a product that you want to get into retail stores, this is maybe not so much the case with online sales today, but if you're going to go to Target or Best Buy or whatever, everything that's on the shelf there usually is sold through some sort of large distributor, right? So you have to work with these distributors and convince them to take your product on and convince the retailers, and they will in turn convince the retailers that they should carry your product. So our VP of Business Development and we went around with our first patent and we would show it to people and we would talk about the marketplace and they would see it and say, wait a minute, that looks like EFI's product. And we said, no, that's our product. And they're like, oh, well, wait a minute, but you're the patent holder. I'm like, that's correct. Well, we don't want to carry EFI's product because if you guys are going to fight patent battles, people are going to return the product and that's going to that's a nightmare for us. And we're like, well, we would welcome your business. So what ended up happening for the first few months is EFI, no distributor wanted to take their product because they were afraid that there would be some big patent battle and the product would have to be returned to the channel and come back to them, which would trigger all sorts of nightmares for them, a distributor, in an already very, very tight margin business. So EFI couldn't figure out why no one would carry their product when they were such a well-known brand for their primary business. It's just because by chance the patent office put this picture there. We would drop this on the table during conversations and we would let other people come to that conclusion without really saying no otherwise. Now, we couldn't say that EFI infringed, nor could we say that we had patented EFI's thing, but people came to the conclusion that there would be a brewing battle and they didn't want to be anywhere near that, right? They wanted to go with who they thought would be the winner, which is who the patent office granted the patent to for the different embodiment, right? So again, I had no idea I could ever use a patent to close business deals that would exclude my competitor from getting their product in the channel, right? So everything you make an investment in from a business perspective is an asset and is a piece on the board. And I think part of the challenge for you as an entrepreneur is how could I reuse this and repurpose this piece of information or knowledge or advantage in other parts of the business to help further a goal. And again, I don't know if other people since have done this sort of thing, but for us, it was really the ability within the company, talking as entrepreneurs, and as a small company about how to use all the resources we had and all the things we had gained that gave us, again, an advantage, right? So we were 6 months ahead easily when we went to market in terms of our development, and probably another 6 months ahead because we locked them out of the channel. Any questions on that?
Not for now.
Okay, great. So again, to summarize patents here, there are some misconceptions regarding patents. And again, I don't want to say that every one of you out there patent, but for those that, the point is for you to stimulate thinking about, again, how am I going to create IP? How am I going to defend IP? And how am I going to keep innovating IP, right? Now, in the case of a physical product or biotech or some other stuff, people think, all right, well, I have a patent, so I can build my product in my business. No, that's not the case. If your invention, if your novelty, your innovation depends on something else that's patented, either in the production of that device or the use of that device, you may be forced into a cross-licensing situation. So you don't know, just because you've invented something, that you can actually go to market successfully and get it out there, because you may be blocked by somebody else, someone else's intellectual property strategy and patent position or otherwise, right? Another misconception by entrepreneurs is, oh, I don't need patents. Well, maybe for some businesses you don't, right? If you're building a website, a web portal, and it's more of a brand-oriented business and a marketing-oriented business, that may not be the case. But regardless, most investors, tech investors anyway, are going to want to have some assurance that you've thought about intellectual property strategy and that you have the freedom to operate, that what you think you want to build and deliver to the market, you will not have barriers to entry because of someone else's intellectual property strategy, which could involve patents. I don't know what to patent is a common misconception. Oh, I see a hand up there. Do we want to, was there a question directly related to that?
Yes, Ravi.
Go ahead, Ravi.
Okay. Let's say you filed several patents, say just one patent in several countries, say Europe, India, China, UK, and some other place of Singapore and all. But then there's a big company, huge company with billions of dollars in revenue and big muscle. They have a very small office in an unknown country, and they copy your patent and do it there, and then incorporate in that product everywhere else. How do you protect? Does your patent in other countries protect that from happening?
Right. So now you'll still have to take legal action, right? So if someone goes to another country where you may not have had patent protection and they seek to build it there, your patents in the countries where you've gotten it issued should allow you to be able to go to court and prevent that product from being imported in your market, in that market space where you have protection, right? So a lot of US companies will prevent overseas knockoffs of things being imported through patent protection, right? So that's, yeah, obviously we can't conceive of a patent everywhere. Some people will sell to markets that are not, are not your primary markets, and you could choose to go there. And honestly, if you choose to file there, now if they've gotten a patent in that country, I would be very surprised, especially if frankly they're ripping off verbatim what you've done in another country, because that would be prior art. So they'd have to do something different. What they might be able to do is, again, if there's no patent coverage in that country, they might be able to build it, but they'll have problems selling it in their primary markets, because once you find out about it, you should be able to exercise you should be able to flex that patent in a court of law and prevent that company, either the importer or that company, if they have a U.S. presence, from selling that product to that particular marketplace. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. As I mentioned, sometimes people say, oh, I don't know what to patent. Well, that's why doing patent research is great, because you become a domain expert. You understand, components, suppliers, alternate ways of building the thing. It really broadens your thinking beyond what it is that you had as that first singular idea. You think about how it might be manufactured, how it might be distributed, how it might be used in concert with other devices, what other approaches that might be used as an alternate to your product, that someone might want to patent around your thing. What might they do? So if you don't know what to patent, that might be an interesting question. If you believe patents aren't part of your strategy, then doing some patent research can be very helpful to helping you flesh all that out. Patents are expensive. I hit that up front, right? We don't need to file full applications. You might be able to hit provisional patents. And again, if you do if you as the technical founder or business founder start to do a prior art search yourself online to the extent that you can, that investment in time could be reused later when you file your full applications. Another misconception is no one cares about patents. Well, you want to try to start a business in biotech or pharma, medical diagnostics or devices without them, good luck. No one's going to invest in a business that is going to purport to have some sort of intellectual property that doesn't have a patent protection in these market spaces, right? Or at least has a patent strategy that explains why they don't need them or why they might have licensing agreements that'll get them the pieces of technology that they need to put together to create that particular device. And then, as you said, well, big companies would crush us anyway, and that's where I normally tell my story about EFI, threatening that they're going to get their big bad patent attorneys after us, and then, in fact, beating them with 12 patents to the marketplace and using the patents in very creative ways that I think my patent attorney at the time, who was also an MIT grad, was really liked working with us because I would come up with all sorts of crazy ideas. In fact, you know what? Let me tell a side story. This loophole has since been plugged. But if you noticed, as I mentioned, as I show here in my first patent, there were other publications listed. And those publications, it gives a serial number. They're not published yet, but it's showing my intent to, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 patent applications pending. So when our first application came out, it was disclosing that I've got 6 more behind this. So when EFI had their first patent issued, which I don't have a copy handy, they had their publications also listed. And I forget how many they had, a couple more. So I went to my patent attorney. I said, wait a minute, those other publications, that's what they have filed. Well, they filed those, right? It was like, well, yeah, it looks that way. I said, those serial numbers, can we use those serial numbers to find out anything more about it? He says, well, maybe. So at the time, they used to publish those provisional patents and what they were filing, even though it hadn't been completely adjudicated. So I had my patent attorney hire another patent attorney, and we decided, in the best interest of the US government's time and the patent examiner who's going to be looking at this other company stuff, we sent them a lot of information about our competitors' filings to show prior art. So we said, oh, this claim can't be claimed as novel because this person did this work or this person did this work. So for the 3 or 4 applications that EFI had disclosed in their patent applications, we did homework to find out what they were and sent the examiner, their examiner, through another attorney, a bunch of literature to invalidate all their claims. So when EFI's patent actually issued, all those claims got watered down and were essentially useless. So again, it was a David and Goliath story. We were the little company that was trying to be as clever and as creative with every edge that we got to push back against the big, the 800-pound gorilla in the market space. I don't know if I've told that story in years past, but it was some. Now, since we did that, you cannot actually go in and do that anymore because the patent office will not disclose the claims or the examiner in the way that we were able to take advantage of that time. So anyway. Again, I don't want to beat this too much with making all this about patents, but it was, when you go off and you try to hire, this goes back to one of the first questions we had in the class, which was, wow, this is a lot of stuff, right? How do I keep track of this, and how do I even begin to track it? And at the time I said advisors. But one of your important advisors from an IP perspective is picking patent counsel, right? Not just for the tactical filing of applications, but to sit down and understand what are you trying to accomplish as a business, right? So when you meet with patent counsel, you're going to take, well, I didn't at the time, and nor should you, but they should be able to go through all the mechanics of filing a patent. What really matters when you pick good patent attorneys is they're going to sit down, the good patent attorney will sit down and says, tell me about your business. What markets are you going after? Who are your competitors? What do you seek to protect? Where's your business going to be in 3 to 5 years, right? You want your patent counsel to also be strategic thinkers, right?
Yeah,
what
it's
are you
good.
trying to protect? Hello, I think we've got folks, someone's got their mic on. If you can mute your mic when you're not, that would be great, just so that we don't talk over one another. So understanding that your patent counsel has good business acumen, that they also can be partners with you in crafting an IP strategy you want to protect. Now, partners are very expensive to work with directly. So at an IP firm, you're going to want to meet the associates that are going to be working more closely with you and interview the associates, because they're the ones who are probably going to work the hardest to get your patents prepared. Okay, and you want to make sure that they have relevant domain expertise, right? So just because they've done tech, well, maybe it's the wrong kind of tech. If they are experts at biochemistry and you're doing something that involves, microelectronic fabrication processes, those may not be close enough an expertise in your space. And then you also want to make sure that they're going to bill you reasonably, right? You want to understand what all those charges are going to be up front and try to prepare some sort of budget so that you yourself don't get sticker shock and you're working within the limited dollars you have that you try to get raised. And also don't get billed for small stuff. Sometimes they, bill you for small hours or, shipping and stuff like that. Try to negotiate as much of that up front as you can. And, if you get through the contest and you do well, a lot of people will try to give you discounts on stuff because they know downstream as more investment money comes in your company that they want to keep earning your business. Okay? So, and again, this applies whether you do patents or you just want an advisor to help you with intellectual property strategy, crafting. Hopefully this provides some major questions to think about. Now, when we started Virtual Inc., lastly, I said cut costs by traveling to visit with them. Our patent counsel was actually in California and we were in Boston. So I would fly out once a quarter to review the status of our portfolio rather than having to come out and visit and put them up, because it was easier for me to visit out there than for them to send their team of attorneys and get put up in hotels and yada, yada, yada. So thinking those secondary expenses you don't think about as a patent expense, but it is a support expense, that you don't want to get billed out of it at an extraordinary rate. And in Boston, if you choose to start your business in Boston or on the West Coast or basically today, any major US city is going to have, that is a tech hub, an entrepreneurial hub, is going to have fantastic patent counsel. And as part of the MIT community, you could probably talk to 2 or 3 entrepreneurs and or advisors and get a handful of people that you might want to talk to and a reference to maybe an MIT grad who works at one of these firms who's willing to work with an MIT student.
Yonald, on that point about MIT, there was a question earlier that we skipped about that. If you ever consider the option of using MIT TLO for your patents?
Good question. So the TLO gets factored, as I understand it, TLO, which stands for the Technology Licensing Office at MIT, it's my understanding that their sphere of authority relates to sponsored research dollars. So if you're going to launch a business based on something that was developed on sponsored research dollars, then you have to work with the TLO to either license that research or come to some agreement about what MIT's rights are going to be in licensing that research or perhaps participating in your company. That is a whole other process that I don't have visibility into, because everything we did for Virtual Inc. was educational resources or not sponsored by MIT, right? The lab kits that I had built, that original prototype, fell under the purview of education, which was not sponsored research dollars. That was, and the professor who I worked with and that we did, that I was a TA for, was very adamant that all MIT educational resources are provided free to students to do whatever. And in the years past, since, there have been other students in 6111 that have built interesting projects. One of the first companies, NBX, that did the internet-based telephone, an IP-based telephone, was built as a lab project in that class. And as a result of that engagement, I was able to, I think, successfully negotiate with TLO. Our engagement with TLO at the time was to get a waiver. TLO wrote us a waiver saying that MIT didn't have any rights at all to what we were doing because we did not use any sponsored research dollars. Now, they were helpful in giving us some pointers and some advice, but because their purview is sponsored research dollars, you know, they weren't heavily involved beyond the first generation of the waiver going forward. Unfortunately, that's an area that I don't have a lot of expertise, but we, you know, if that was something that folks wanted to follow up, again, I'm sure we could find someone who had more direct TLO experience that would be helpful. Does that help? I know it's not, does that answer the question more or less? Okay. All right. Was there another question?
There was a question from Henny.
Yeah, so I have a question, mostly their US patent versus international. Like, say, if you get invited by an international company at the office in the US and you present your project, you might not review all the technical detail, but you sort of review the general idea.
Yep.
But you don't have the international patent, you have a US patent. So is that, can they claim that you did the public disclosure, even though, I mean, the presentation is in the US, but it's over the internet where they have people watching, the employee watching from other countries?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. I would recommend to have a non-disclosure agreement in place regardless, right? And you have to figure out whether US law will apply or whether foreign law, but you're going to want US law probably if you can. You want them signing your non-disclosure. If you think you're going to be in that situation, it probably would be a good idea to get a provisional patent filed with as much relevant detail, well, a relevant detail, but wide enough so that any variations in what you plan to protect would still be covered in that provisional within a year later. So this way, they couldn't come back after the fact because you would have something that predates that meeting already filed, right, with the US Patent Office. So if you file a provisional, then you file your actual, you file a provisional, then you have a bunch of business meetings with other companies, whether they be in the US or overseas. When you do file your full patent application, you can refer back to that original patent application, which hopefully predates any public engagement, and therefore not have it deemed as being a public disclosure and therefore invalidating the patent. But you're right. Some people have been unscrupulous in trying to do that sort of thing and get you to talk about something on the promise of a partnership or something else, because it's part of their offensive strategy is to get you to talk as much as possible and then ruin you later when you're trying to file things. That's a good question. That's a good question. Definitely an NDA, and to the extent you can, you may want to use provisional patents.
Well, so technically in our case, we actually already have the patent in the US. We just don't have the international patent. And so what do you do with that? And it wasn't give us an early warning sign that this actually was recorded and there's employee watching from other countries.
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you go internationally, I don't know if you want to have filed your PCT application, right, your Patent Cooperation Treaty patent, which allows you to go overseas. If you file that within that window, you're probably okay as well. But the reality is you're probably going to be talking to non-US companies about partnerships before then anyway. So, and again, these nuances change. Best bet would be to talk to some patent counsel to make sure that there isn't a loophole, or they might say, no, it's not a problem because if you file in the US, that is valid. As long as you're within the window of subsequent filings, it doesn't matter. Right? And then frankly, if you have a non-disclosure agreement, you know, that may be helpful as well, although I'm not sure what the legal precedent in the use of non-disclosures with respect to patent, you know, being misconstrued as a public disclosure. I can tell you that when I was raising money for another company that I'd started, the investors wanted to see our patent applications or wanted to see where we're patenting. And so they had to sign a different agreement. Well, I guess it's called a common interest agreement, where they would not, it was basically a stronger NDA so that they wouldn't blab about this and it wouldn't be construed public disclosure because it was a due diligence exercise. Right? So they may, again, talking to an attorney will help clarify if such due diligence exercises in the furtherance of a business deal constitute public disclosure or not. Generally, again, I'm not an attorney, but generally they should not be because they aren't public disclosures. They are disclosures under agreements with select individuals and entities. Okay.
Thank you.
Is there one more question here?
We have a question from the chat from Nelly. She's asking, how would you approach patenting for an early stage startup that is doing its market search and R&D on a biomedical device. There is not definitive product yet.
Yeah, so I would look for, I would start to do, online patent searches. Now, what's difficult with doing online patent, do I hit this in the next slide about, hang on 1 second. Yeah, all right. So one of the challenges with doing patent research today is if you use some of the free patent search engines online, those companies are tracking your searches, right? So, and I don't know what's done with that data, right? So if you go to Google Patents and you start searching for patents and patents and patents, I don't know what Google does with your patent search log, right? Or other companies. So you're better off, if you can, trying to go to primary materials, but doing it from the Patent Office website, the actual government Patent Office website, and doing your searches there, right? Your keyword searches. Now, and this is something that perhaps Joe, our lecturer here, might have some more insight about other companies that can help you do patent searches in a more intelligent and broader mechanism that allow you to pivot and do keyword-based searches or patent code-based searches so that you can find out what's going on. There is a lot of body of work in biotech and pharma and drug discovery and so on. And I would be very surprised if there aren't resources either like of the sort that Joe's company, IP Vision, used to do. But I would be cautious about doing it on using free services on the internet, but instead going onto the USPTO website and frankly, just start typing in keywords and searches and seeing what comes back. And what comes back are all those fields in the patents themselves, which are going to be various codes that this patent might relate to, that you should then go forward and look at as well and try to spider out from there and say, okay, what do I know? And then you'll see common patterns of who are the competitors, who are the common inventors, how is this particular apparatus or device or whatever described in the patent literature, and how is it defended? Okay, so go on the USPTO's website and start your search. That's really the best way to do that. I can think about it. All right, one more quick question on this, if there is any, or can I continue?
I don't see any for now.
Okay, all right. All right, to summarize an IP strategy, what we thought then as students coming out of the contest and starting off our investment round is, oh, we need the patents to convince the investors to give us money. Really what I learned is that that whole IP strategy process was integral to our whole product and market development, spot on, right? We're able to block a competitor from, frankly, releasing features of their product and getting into the marketplace with it. Looking back at it, what I do differently, frankly, not a whole lot. I was very lucky in that I had good advisors, good attorneys, and I was very aggressive myself in trying to think through bottlenecks and systems and components and performance issues that we could potentially patent. Again, my recommendation is think about what is your core, sustainable, unfair, competitive, differentiating advantage. And if it's intellectual property, consider how to best, to protect it, develop it and continue to innovate with it. One of the fun things we did early on was when we were just starting the company and we had a company name and a logo, is we had patent notebooks developed for all the engineering team. And we had our logo on it and we distributed it to everyone. And there's a company that still, I think, still makes these. You send them a logo and they screen print it on the because there's actually a standard patent notebook form that is recommended that you use so you can document your ideas. And then what we would do is we would do a pizza party every month and everyone would sign and co-sign their invention disclosures. And it was just sort of a good morale boosting thing to keep innovation on the forefront of everyone's mind. I don't know, there's something kind of cool about having your startup company's logo on stuff. It just makes it feel that much more real. And putting it on something that's going to be recording intellectual property helps those feel like they're part of the, really part of the offensive and defensive strategy for making things go forward well. All right. I think I'm going to skip this because we talked about provisional patents. and some of these old IP tricks are no longer available. All right, now, this is why you pay the big bucks to attend the class at MIT and attend this lecture. What I'm going to do here over the next, I don't know, 30 minutes or so is present to you. This is the first time I've done this virtually, so I'm really hoping people don't take screenshots, don't record this, because it has been 20 years, but I do this, I do name names, I do go in detail about what happens round after round. If you want some of this material, please contact Joe, and Joe will contact me, and I'd be happy to talk with some of you in a limited capacity, but I really do not want to see these slides up on the internet because it could cause me grave harm. But I'm taking the risk because I think it's important for folks to see, practically speaking, what happens when you raise venture capital to you as the founder, and what happens to all the equity holders as you go on, all right? So buckle up, because it's going to be quite a ride for the next few minutes here. Now, I do want to quickly talk a bit about what founder value looks like when you take VC money, right? So let's assume you're going to build, you're going to start a company as founders, and it's worth some size of a pie. And the founders put in $100, and you're working to build value. Hang on while I get the control of mine. Oh. Yeah, you're working to build value, and you're building value, and that pie is getting larger and larger. And at some point, you raise, let's say, $5 million at a $5 million pre, right? So the Series A investors get red, the founders get brought down to 0.5% ownership in the company. Usually at that point, the investors are going to want to see you create an option pool. So your part, gets smaller. You work harder, you build that pie, maybe you raise more money at that point. So now there's another investor on board, and you assume a $200 million exit, and maybe there's an acquisition or an IPO, but wait, because those are preferred investors, there may be other ride-on, other conversion events where they convert their maybe they're participating preferred, so their preferred stock not only prefers, also converts on a per share basis by preferred, but also additional shares and warrants and other things. And now maybe there's dividends, which also convert. And that, so what happens is these term sheets are written in a way where, frankly, your ownership as an entrepreneur starts getting crammed down. And if there are multiple founders, then that splits up the pie. So for a venture capital backed model, when you're going to be raising, let's say $10 to $15 million, unless you can affect the size of this pie with revenue significantly, those numbers aren't going to be atypical. And then, then you get that and taxes and so on. So you as an entrepreneur, in a typical VC-backed thing, the likelihood of seeing a lot of payoff, again, unicorns notwithstanding, but that's why the unicorns aren't necessarily great. It's a pretty high risk venture. So this is what you might think of VCs later on as well. But their life isn't easy either, right? The life of a venture capitalist, if they have a $500 million fund, they have an operating fee of 2%, 5 partners, they've got maybe, let's say, 7 to 10 investments they do a year, maybe $5 million for those first few investments. So you start doing the math of their time. Every VC partner, every year and a half, they're trying to raise a new fund. They're going to 2-3 conferences a year. They don't, they take much of August off. So they've got 9 months of work to do. They're serving on 5 to 7 boards. That's 4 to 5 board meetings a year. So that means 35 board meetings a year. So every week they are traveling. Again, this is pre-COVID. They're traveling to a board meeting or coming for a board meeting. Then they've got partner calls every week. So they have, really only a couple days a week to hear actual pitches. And this is why in this class we emphasize pitches, because they'll reject 99% of them. So they've got to listen to 1,000 plans a year per partner to get the kind of deal flow, which means there's very little time to hear actual pitches. And then they have to deal with their, they have to hear, so they have maybe about 8 to 10 hours of time to hear really well qualified deals that are coming to them for that 2 to 5%. So that's why, you really have only a few minutes to sort of, you only have a few minutes to really pitch what's going on. Things to know about VCs, I'll just quickly summarize these as well. Part of what's important here is validating the market size is critical, right? Is critical to validating the market, and validating the market size is an essential part of trying to get that, that investor pre-money valuation set. Now, there may not be a lot of wiggle room, but if you're nailing the revenue and/or market size and projected market size and growth, that's going to be your best lever for changing that pre-money valuation. If you're not able to do that, arguing the option pool size and pre-money valuation can maybe help. Sometimes when you meet with VCs, you don't get a clear answer, right? This has been an experience often I've heard from many entrepreneurs. You don't get a yes after 2 meetings with a venture capitalist, and you spent more than 7 hours in trying to educate an investor, move on. Your time is important, right? You have a finite amount of time with which you have to identify investors, get a term sheet, and close that investment, to keep your business going. So you have to be you have to track your time very well to make sure that, it's going to feel weird telling a venture capitalist no and moving on to the other investor if you don't get a yes, particularly if you get a yes, but kind of answer. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. Often I get the question, well, where do I find VCs, right? Well, attorneys, accountants, bankers, they all work with venture capitalists. And sometimes you can get a referral that way if you can meet some of those service professionals. And you can meet some of those service professionals through a number of events in and around the MIT entrepreneurial community, or, you might reach out to alumni funds. You might reach out to alumni who are associates at venture capital funds, right? So if you can find an MIT alum, often they'll pick up the call and talk to an MIT alum that way. There's some industry groups. There's, the Entrepreneurship Forum. I don't know if MITx still operates by that name, but these are things where you can get those kind of investor referrals and your peer community as well, right? All right. And other VC investors. Sometimes an investor you meet with says, hey, you know what? I'll be honest with you. This is a really interesting business, but we're not making investments in this sector, or this is too risky for us. But let me introduce you to someone who could. And if they don't offer it, you should ask, who should I be talking to? Should I be talking to here? Should I be talking to someone else, on the West Coast or, Midwest or something? Who is it that you think I should be talking to? Who would be a good business partner that I might want to partner up with? So investor meetings can often be, frankly, for you to pitch the idea, but also just to solicit information, particularly when you're early on, so that you're not necessarily trying to pitch for money, but you're just trying to size up and get help with your business plan. And if you go through the business plan contest, that helps as well in terms of tightening up your business plan to actually meet with a VC and to talk about your business. Again, VCs tend to invest locally, so unless they're a firm that has offices across the country, Boston VCs are great for life sciences and tech, and maybe on the rise again. But Silicon Valley is very great for a lot of the social media stuff. It was emerging for a bit for medical devices. I don't know how it is. And what I found is that in the US, most VCs take August off. So don't try to raise money or close a deal then. Get it done before August, or be ready to restart in September. And then, they'll be really hungry to invest again in September, and you don't want to close that again before the winter holidays kick in. All right. I'm going to race through this, but this is actually fundraising I did for another business, over 15 years ago, that was started with a student in this class who asked me to run their business. And I was trying to raise money for our first round of venture capital. And again, I knew a lot of venture capitalists. And what this chart is, it's a bar chart of all the different investors. I blotted out their names and how much time I spent with each investor trying to figure out if I can get to a deal, right? So the vertical axis is ours, and the horizontal bars are each individual investor, all right? So I started, I think, with 31 investors, and most of them said, oh, this is interesting, but there might have been a but. And so that quickly whittled down to, 7 investors said, oh, let's have another meeting to follow up. And that get whittled down to a handful more that say, oh, we really like this, right? We want to explore getting a term sheet in front of you, right? And at this stage, we got a draft term sheet from one, and we got a term sheet signed. The serious investors were the ones that hung on. I would say, like I said, in the 4-hour mark, 7-hour mark, you really should be talking to serious investors only. Now, the problem is, how do you know a serious investor from other type of investors. And I think there are other helpful investors I mentioned, which are those that say, oh, this isn't for us, but let me refer you to someone else's, which is what happened here. This is the area where I want to caution you, where you talk to an investor and they keep playing, go fetch me a rock, right? Go get me a rock. Oh, not this rock. I want another rock, right? Where they keep asking you questions about, oh, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about that. I want to know about, and so you end up spending hours upon hours educating that investor, but not feeling like you're getting closer to a yes, right? It's just like, okay, where are we now? Well, you know, they need to know this. Well, what I found out in this particular case was this investor was interested in another startup that was doing something similar to ours. And they were wasting my time asking due diligence questions about my business that they were in turn feeding off to help that other business. And it was awful. It was awful sort of stuff. So we ended up, once I found out that was happening, I stopped talking to them. But this sort of thing can happen. So my rule of thumb is if I can't get to the 5 to 7 hour mark, and I can start to tell when people are serious because they stop asking as much questions. And really, after 7 to 8 hours, and this is 7 to 8 hours of FaceTime, right? This is communication time with the investor. This isn't all the hours of prep on top of that, because for every hour of communication time I make with an investor, there's probably 1 to 2 hours of preparation of a new slide, of some research, of some gathering of some facts, of some financial spreadsheet stuff. So what you're seeing here is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of total time over a 4-month period that I raised money for that next startup. Okay, let me jump ahead here. I'm going to actually skip some of this, but say really again, you know, if you can't get to yes with whoever you're talking to financially, move on. You'll often heard the phrase friends, families, and fools. If there are grant opportunities like SBIRs, STTRs, which are non-dilutive in terms of money, they're just grants, that's great. Look for incubators, look for work for hire, where people hire you to perhaps do some work and you can take that consulting revenue to build a business in a non-dilutive way. Anything where you can exchange your services in a way that builds, that starts to build your product or service for your business is great. But even when you do take on consulting revenue, you got to be careful that doesn't pull you in a direction that's not core to your business strategy going forward. And again, don't be afraid to say no, thank you. Investors hate it when you pass. So if you have the gumption to pass on an investor, you know, they may come back to you as they start to hear that you're talking to other folks as well. Again, prove that business model and market viability, right? Find early adopters who can offer feedback on the non-disclosure. Paying customers never hurts, especially if they'll pay you to build a product for them that they'll want to buy your product later. And then ask them in their own words to characterize what that product or service, what interests you about what we're doing? Because sometimes what you think as the entrepreneur that you're selling as a product or service and the value proposition that you think is important turns out to be different than what the actual perceived value is by your prospective customers. And to the extent that you can always show early sales growth or adoption, that just helps nail viability, especially if you think that's sustainable. Just because you sell one prototype or one customer, that's not a pattern. But if you start to lay a foundation where that becomes a pattern, those are great and potentially great leading indicators for what could happen with your business. All right, so you all have a copy of the original Virtual Link business plan, which again is not a how-to guide on how to write your business plan, but it's, you know, what we thought in that plan that would bring us to profitability was $3 million. That was insanely off. What we learned, honestly, through all that was prototypes, demos, early adopters, early users mattered in the shaping of our product over time, and that our original market was education. Is what we had originally had in our student business plan. In the business plan that Virtual Link pursued, it was all about consultants and knowledge workers in corporate America as the primary users. But today, Virtual Link or Mimeo, I should say, in its current incarnation, makes most of its money selling educational related products. In fact, at my son's high school, they have Mimeo, and he gets to brag that his dad invented the Mimeo that's used in the classroom. What I do differently? Lots. And I think I told lots of small stories about different things financially. First of all, don't raise $70 million in venture capital without someone watching how that's spent and having a really solid budget in place. Do not get blindly talked into get big fast. This was the mantra of venture capitalists early on. A venture capitalist model, again, they're betting across a portfolio. You're just one of a number of things they're betting, right? And the way that they raise their venture capital funds, $500 million, $1 billion or more, they have to write big checks each time. So it's not uncommon for venture capitalists to want to write you a $5 million check or larger, because that's the bite size that they got to get to work. If they're writing $1 million checks for $1 billion fund, they got to write 1,000 checks, in a couple of years, and that's not practical to manage, right? They don't want to be managing 500 investments. They want to manage fewer big dollar investments that they think are going to go somewhere, which means they're going to want to write you bigger checks, which may not be aligned with what you need to get done. So you should understand the economics of your business better than they do. I would have fired the CEO I hired earlier if I had looking back at it, and I would have hired a CFO much sooner. I think that's the key lesson from the finance portion of this talk. And this is, 9/11 was an awful thing that happened. But what it did usher in, as did COVID, essentially, was a resurgence in telepresence and remote collaboration tools, internet-based collaboration tools. We had started looking at that, but we had no idea, obviously, 9/11 was going to happen. But I think one of the things that would have catapulted the business further, at least in the corporate America, was to start looking at telepresence tools and partners as a core part of the strategy. That what's missing when you're online and talking to people is the ability to synthesize at a whiteboard in a conference room and to share an electronic whiteboard and to mark things up. And, when no one was flying post 9/11, one of the big problems in corporate America was exactly that. How do I do, real-time co-ideation at a whiteboard between my teams, which are located in different places? All right. So now I want to wrap this up in the next few minutes here. The question is, are you ready, right? As entrepreneurs who are listening to this talk today, right? It's really, it's gut check time. Are you really ready to do this? Because believe it or not, now is the best time, right? The earlier in your career, the less baggage that you have, as you go on in life, you start to accumulate things that slow you down as just a course of life. So the earlier you are in your career to do this, the more freedom and liberty you have to go take on that risk without a lot of risk aversion setting in. The other thing too is risk is not the same as pain, right? Everyone knows that if you go to MIT, you can handle a lot of pain, right? You can work hard, long hours, but can you handle the risk, right? Can you handle the uncertainty that comes with a startup, right? Not knowing if you're going to raise money in a certain timetable, right? Will there be a customer? Will I raise investment, right? You've got to believe so wholeheartedly that people will believe in you as much as they will in the idea, and that you can take that idea to the next step because you're the one that's going to make it happen, right? And so, despite the risk and the uncertainty, that your belief in pulling this thing across the line is going to make the difference. The other thing is really, what do you want out of an entrepreneurial experience if this is your first venture, right? Do you want to learn to run a company? Do you want to just get practice at some CXO role or become a VP in some tech company later? Do you just want to follow the life cycle of what it takes to bring a product to market? Do you want to just own a small company and make respectable earnings, where you don't necessarily, go big and try to become, some sort of VC-backed unicorn company? Or are you looking for, more material things? I'm joking here, but you're looking for what is it that you want to pursue is going to really direct your focus and plan as an entrepreneur, right? So if you want to build a business, then go build a business, right? If you're starting a company just to learn to be an operator in a much larger company, well, then that will affect the way you build the company, because you might end up poisoning it for acquisition, and you might have an acquirer in mind and thinking, okay, I'm going to build the company this way because I know I can't do everything, but I'm going to be an acquisition target for a larger business, right? Or maybe you realize, I want to be an entrepreneur, but I don't want to be the entrepreneur that starts the business. I want to be part of an entrepreneurial team, and I want to ride that to see what it takes to build a product or a service and take it to market. Right? So all these things are legitimate things, but you need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, what is it that you're actually wanting? And be honest about your capability, your own ego, and your level of risk tolerance and all of that. Okay. Again, building a team is really important. How many founders? I think 2 to 3 are reasonable. If is your founding team the right team? If it's not, you got to fix it early on, because the longer you wait, the more of a boat anchor negative energy will be if you don't have the right mix of people. And the right mix of people is determined by whether or not you all share the same vision for the business. If you don't, you better, because that will manifest itself as problems and disagreements. And then you'll be tested as a founding team. How well do you manage disagreement? You don't know how, well, you're going to have to learn how, because essentially that founding team, you know, those people, you're going to be married to those people for a few years, ideally, right? What happens when you get rough? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be, you're going to need that founders marriage counseling, if you will, to get through it, right? But again, the team at its core will be the founding team. As I said, it's small, but you start hiring layers and rings around you, right? The management team, the professional management team that's going to be hopefully dealing the stuff that you delegate to certain functions and roles in a way that they might have expertise or complementary core competencies you don't have. Your investors are part of your extended team. They should be more than just bringing money to the table. They should be bringing leads on talent that you might want to hire, either as part of the management team or line management roles. They should be bringing opportunities, market opportunities or market leads to the table, right? And ideally, they should be bringing money, but that should be a small part as time goes on. For directors on your team, on your directors or the outer, directors on your board of directors, you really want people with operational experience. In other words, they sat in your seat as either a founding team member or as a managing team member and ran a business through ups and downs, so they can advise you when you're about to turn a corner and go down some dark alley with your business and give you proper operational advice versus investor-driven financial advice that may be part of a portfolio that, when they lose interest, they may not be able to help you. And again, other advisors, sanity checkers, other gurus, folks that are in the MIT orbit that can help you as part of the entrepreneurial circles. Lawyers and accountants can also be very helpful, and not just limited to their particular areas as attorneys, but also conduits to meeting all these other people as well. So if you're a technical leader, prove you know how to build it. Assume you're not the smartest kid in the block and try to outthink yourself. Developing and protecting and growing IP is your experience, is your responsibility, and it will be primarily part of what you're going to be expected to do. And then, figure out whether patents or some IP strategy is going to matter for future business leaders in the startup world, right? I didn't really pay attention to this at the beginning in the companies, but cultivate a culture of communication and respect across your company. As I became a more seasoned entrepreneur, if you will, culture matters so much more than you think, right? Respect and communication and excellence really matter. And you as the business leader will set the tone for that, and people will look to you and mimic what you do. So make sure you're doing the right things in that regard. Ask your customers what they're trying to do, not what they want, right? So sometimes customers have an idea of what their solution is, but they leap to a solution without really describing what they want. And this is an opportunity for you to really identify what the problem is, what the real value proposition, and what your MVP to getting it done. If you're a business leader and you're working in a business that is deeply technical, and either you have the chief technology or technology team, take your tech team to go meet with customers and see firsthand how customers react to product prototypes and demos. Otherwise, it becomes a transactional culture where the business people go talk to the customers and the engineers are back here and they don't get a sense of what's going on in the marketplace. And to the extent that you can for your own product, eat at your own restaurant. Use your own product. Be a customer of your own product or service so you can start experiencing what it's like. And then find those customers who would love your offering, even if it's not 100% ready yet, because they make excellent referenceable customers and early adopters to help you inform your mainstream adopters soon. And then don't confuse those CXO roles or VP roles, right? As founders, everyone wants to be CEO or co-CEO or COO. You may have the experience, you might not. but you still may want to hire other vice presidents and so on who will tactically carry the ball on those things, particularly if you're going to be dealing with strategy and be focused externally in the company, but you need folks focused on the internals of what's going on. And really just hire really well, right? I like to say hire slow and fire fast. All right, you'll all get these, but these are books that I've often used. Someone asked about how do I learn about all the financial stuff. There's a great book, a very thin pamphlet, Term Sheets and Valuations by the Boston VC, Alex Wilmerding. On culture, those last 3 books are great. 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Startup Owner's Manual has some sections on it. Results is good about focusing on results. These are books that are on my shelf. Some of them are very dated, but I find that they have lessons learned in them that are really, really good. All right, common fears for technical founders. Someone is going to steal my idea, or I don't have an MBA. I've never managed people. I'm not a people person. I'm losing control. You're not the first person to have these fears, and you're not the last. But honestly, if your idea is so easy to be stolen in one conversation, it's probably not that defensible. And you may want to think about how to make it more defensible, right? You don't have an MBA? Well, if you're a graduate student at MIT and you've managed projects, technical projects, you have some introduction to, if you had, your ops or whatever, or you're a lab staff person, you had other staff, that'll be an entree into figuring out how to manage other people. If you're not a people person, well, then you probably need to learn to be. The biggest thing I see with technical founders is fear of losing control. If you raise money, you are going to lose some control to the extent that you cease to be relevant in the business, or you be obstinate or not the team player. Yeah, getting pushed aside is a real thing. I've seen it happen in other companies. These are common fears, but these are all surmountable, frankly, if you focus on developing good culture. Business founders have sort of the opposite thing. Well, I don't have an idea and I'm not technical, so they fear being pushed aside because they don't feel like they have deep core technical knowledge. Well, that's not true. You bring a lot of market sense and marketing sense and business sense to business. Sometimes they don't feel respected by techies. This is an opportunity for business founders to lead and form that culture. The other fear is, I've got to succeed on my first try or I'm a failure. Not true. Entrepreneurs, those who are successful in many cases, are often serial entrepreneurs who are on their nth activity that finally makes it. Right? Often their first time at the gate is not a win, but ends up being their MBA of School of Hard Knocks, and they learn a lot through those experiences. Okay. Quick mental outline of things. When I'm writing executive summaries for a business plan, I call it the 7 Ps. I try to figure out what the pain, the market pain is, what my product or service solution is, what that value proposition is, the market potential, what the core intellectual property is and how it's defensible, how I make money as profit, and who are the necessary people to make that happen. If you can write a sentence for each of these things, that's your core of an executive summary, and frankly, the core of your pitch deck, right? If you have, you don't need a 50-slide deck to go pitch to a venture capitalist. You cover these things in 7 slides or 10 slides, and you're probably doing okay, right? So, and then when you have this outline, you'll tease this into all the sections that we talked a bit in the class here. All your finance, your marketing plan, all those aspects of things will flow, I think, largely from you're trying to very crisply identify 1 or 2 sentences for each of these things. So use this. I offer this now as a scaffold for you to hang and decorate with some key sentences, especially if you've got writer's block, you just need to sort of really whittle everything down. This can be a very useful exercise and worksheet. All right, parting thoughts. This is my last set of slides, last slide. You, as an entrepreneur, you need to love risk, right? You need to be able to be comfortable with the unknown unknowns that lie ahead of you and blaze forth, charting a course that no one has been there before. Right? You've got to be comfortable with risk. You got to be great. You got to be thinking about your product or service as delivering some really good value to the marketplace, and that you are going to be, by great, I mean ethical, by running a good business, by having good culture, by being a positive force in the way that you run your entity, frankly sends out ripples that people want to be associated with you because you're building a reputable, credible, good business the right way as you're going along. Be humble. You can be great, but you got to be humble. If you think that you're the smartest or the best or whatever, and you're not able to back that up, you're going to be putting blinders on to those threats that can come at you left and right and blindside you. Be collegial. One of the most important things I tell folks who are starting on as entrepreneurs is don't be transactional when you go to networking events. When you go to a networking event, meet other people and find out what they want. And then you should be an interlocutor. The network effect works when everyone is trying to help everyone else. If you come in to an event and you're just transaction looking for you, that's not a networking effect, right? That's you sort of bleeding that particular environment dry. So if you get to make other friends and colleagues and find out what they need and they do the same, you will end up with the network effect working for you and stimulating that whole community as a whole, which means you have more peer entrepreneurs that are rising with you. You get to know other investors who are in the community, get to know other service providers. Being collegial is a really critical part of succeeding as an entrepreneur. And have fun. This is going to take a dominant amount of your time if you choose entrepreneurship as a path. You might as well enjoy it, right? You're going to you got to love the risk. You got to do it great. You got to be humble. You got to be collegial, but have fun. If you're not having fun, then all of what you're dealing with will start to feel like pain, and at some point will wear on you, and other areas of your life might begin to suffer in health as well. So I want to see anyone going out there and doing all these things but not enjoying themselves, because then you're kind of missing the point. And then lastly, enter the entrepreneurship competition. For me, it changed the trajectory of my life in a way that I cannot even begin to understand and explain in such an unpredictable and nonlinear way that has had tremendously great impact on me in my life, and that I can come and give this talk and hopefully inspire other folks. But please enter the contest. Use this class as a springboard for taking whatever idea you have and entering it. I mean, it may be your first of many ideas, but start training that entrepreneurial engine and muscle in your mind about how to pitch these ideas and write these ideas and frame them in a way for the investment community, for bringing on co-founders, for bringing on partners, for bringing on investors. This is a great opportunity to learn that at MIT. It's an awesome environment. I'm always amazed year after year how many more resources and more personnel are available to help you develop your plan, your network, your market analysis, any kind of research you want to do. Enter the contest, and it'll be your first foray into building that network as well. So I wish you all best of luck. I know this is the last day of the class, and you all have a little bit more homework. I usually end up working with a few students who come out of this class. Folks have questions. I encourage you to email me at my email address. You can use my first name at alum.mit, but you got to put nuts and bolts in the subject. Otherwise, I may not see it or pay attention to it. I used to run a blog. I don't have much time to do that anymore, so I've taken that down. But definitely send me likes and dislikes about what you saw in the lecture today or in the class as a whole, or things that you want to see covered. And I'd be happy to try to incorporate, either answer your questions or incorporate that in the future. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Yonald. I mean, fantastic. Again, your presentation. I hope the class really can appreciate the depth and the quality of your experiences and how you convey it. So thank you once again. So as we finish up this session, I'd like to cycle back to the first session of the course, when I raised a number of questions that you needed to be able to figure out, both for yourself and for the people you need to bring along your journey. I'd like to review those now and have you think about the various sessions and the answers that we've tried to give you in one way or another. So those questions, if you recall, are: how do I start? What do I do? What is the problem that I'm solving? How does my solution solve that problem? And who cares about my idea? Specifically cares. Who's my customer? How do I find these people? How will I make money so I can have a sustainable venture? How long will it take to bring my solution to market? What will it cost? What resources will I need? Will I need to set up some sort of entity to do all of this and attract investors and people? How do I keep people from stealing my ideas? Will I need co-founders, and what will be our relationship with each other and the entity? Will we need a founders agreement? How will I negotiate with employees, consultants, investors, strategic partners? How will I figure out what I don't know? And what are the potholes in the road that may come up, and how will I recognize them and hopefully avoid or minimize them? Think back about each session and how we address these directly and sometimes anecdotally, because it's been our goal that when you take your journey, we hope we've helped you to be in the 10% that will succeed. So if and when you launch, let us know. We're always interested. Keep in touch. My email is jgh@mit.edu, and put nuts and bolts in the subject line to make sure I know it's from somebody in the class. So with that, we wish you bon voyage on your journey and all the success in the world. Good night.